He stood between her and the door like he'd planted himself there on purpose, and the man across the table, Holbrook Fenn, cattle baron, self-appointed conscience of Dusty Creek, said it loud enough for the whole dining room to hear. "You brought the Grady girl to my table, Weston. I didn't know you'd taken to collecting strays." The room went still. Not the polite kind of still. The kind that happens when everyone is pretending they didn't hear something they very clearly heard. Weston Greer didn't sit down. He set his hat on the back of the chair slowly, the way a man does when he's deciding something, and he looked at Fenn the way you look at a fence post you're about to pull out of the ground. "Her name," he said, "is Mabel Grady, and she's the smartest person at this table. That includes you, Holbrook. Especially you." Mabel didn't move. She had learned a long time ago that if you moved when someone said something like that about you, if you flinched, if you looked down, if you let your hands shake where anyone could see, you handed them exactly what they wanted. So she sat with her back straight and her eyes forward, and she let Weston Greer's words land in the middle of that dining room, like a stone dropped into still water. She watched the ripples. Mabel Grady had grown up on the east edge of Dusty Creek, in a house that leaned slightly to the left because her father had never gotten around to fixing the foundation, and he never would now. Her mother had died when Mabel was 11, and her father, Thomas Grady, had followed 6 years later, not from grief exactly, but from the slow accumulation of bad harvests and worse luck and a cough that started one winter and never quite left. He left her the house, the lean and 31 acres of land that everyone in town seemed to know about and no one seemed to respect. She had taught herself to read contracts from a box of her father's old papers. She had walked 4 miles each way to the county seat twice a year to sit in the back of the courthouse and watch proceedings. She had written letters to a lawyer in Cheyenne, who had, to her surprise, written back long, careful letters full of case law and procedural notes that she read until the ink faded. None of this made her welcome at Holbrook Fenn's dinner table. What got her there was Weston Greer. Weston ran the second largest ranch in the county, which meant he was the second most powerful man in a county where Fenn had spent 30 years making sure no one forgot who was first. He was tall in a way that didn't announce itself, quiet in a way that made people lean in, and he had the particular kind of reputation that came from never saying anything he didn't mean and never meaning anything he didn't follow through on. People in Dusty Creek trusted Weston Greer the way they trusted the almanac, not because he was flashy, because he was right. He had come to Mabel 3 months ago about the water rights on the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of both their properties. She had expected him to be like the others, polite enough to her face, dismissive the moment she opened her mouth about anything that mattered. Instead, he had sat down at her kitchen table and listened for 2 hours while she laid out what she'd found in the county land records, and at the end of it he had said quietly, "You're the only person in this county who's actually read those documents." "I know," she said. "Fenn hasn't. He doesn't need to. He pays people to read things for him, and then he pays other people to make sure the first people tell him what he wants to hear." Weston had looked at her for a long moment. "How long have you known about the diversion?" 14 months, she said. "Since the spring before last, when my northeast pasture started going dry in July." He nodded slowly. "My south field, too. It's not drought," she said. "He built a diversion channel on the upper section, redirected about 40% of the flow. It's on survey maps from the original land grant. What he did is illegal, has been since 1871. Weston looked at the map she'd unrolled on the table. He looked at her. "What do you want to do about it?" he asked. It was the first time in her adult life that anyone with the power to actually do something had asked her that question. She said, "I want to prove it." The dinner at Holbrook Fenn's house had not been Mabel's idea. Fenn had extended the invitation through his foreman, a lean-faced man named Crisp, who delivered messages with the expression of someone who had been told to smile and couldn't quite remember how. The invitation had come 3 days after Mabel filed a formal complaint with the county land office, and 2 days after Weston had backed that complaint with a sworn affidavit. Fenn had framed it as a social occasion. A chance to clear the air, he'd said, resolve misunderstandings between neighbors. His wife, Dorothy Fenn, would prepare a proper supper. Weston had said he wasn't going without Mabel. Fenn had said that was fine, of course. Everyone was welcome, the more the merrier. And so here they were. The dining room of Fenn's house was the kind of room that existed to remind you of something. The furniture was heavy and dark. The chandelier held 12 candles. The wallpaper was imported from somewhere and patterned with flowers that didn't grow in Wyoming. Dorothy Fenn sat at one end of the table with the expression of a woman who had learned to be gracious the way other people learned to be soldiers, through long practice and the occasional wound. There were 6 other guests, all ranchers or merchants of varying degrees of alliance with Fenn. Mabel had cataloged them before she sat down. 2 of them she knew from the courthouse. One of them she recognized as a man who had once told her father his land wasn't worth what he was asking for it. All of them had looked at her when she walked in with the particular expression people use when they're trying to decide if you're an inconvenience or a threat. Fenn had waited until the soup was served to make his remark about strays. Now the room was quiet, and Weston was still standing. "Weston," Fenn said, with the careful patience of a man recalibrating, "I meant no offense to the young lady. It's just, this is a complicated matter, a legal matter. Perhaps better discussed without her?" Weston said. "She's a girl with a small holding and a grudge," Fenn said. "The complaint is a nuisance. The kind of thing that gets filed and then forgotten." "The kind of thing," Mabel said, "that gets filed and then forgotten when the person who filed it doesn't have documentation." She reached into the satchel she'd carried in and set a folded document on the table. Fenn looked at it, then at her. "Original survey map," she said, 1869. "Filed with the territorial office in Cheyenne. The creek boundary is marked on page 3. The diversion channel your crew built in the spring of '84 crosses the established easement by approximately 60 feet. She set a second document beside the first. Engineering report, commissioned by the county assessor's office in response to my complaint, confirms the deviation. She set down a third. Affidavit from your own former foreman, a Mr. Tully Briggs, who supervised the construction and who as of last week no longer works for you." The room had gone quiet again. A different kind of quiet this time. Dorothy Fenn was looking at the documents with the expression of a woman who had just realized the evening was not going to end the way she'd planned. Fenn himself was looking at Mabel with the careful stillness of a man trying to figure out when exactly he'd lost control of the room. "Where did you get a statement from Briggs?" he asked. "I asked him for one," Mabel said. "He gave it. He doesn't have the authority." "He has the memory," she said. "And the conscience." Apparently both were available. Fenn set down his fork. The sound of it against the china was very small and very loud. "You came into my home," he said. "To my table. You invited me," she said. "I assumed you wanted to settle this like reasonable people. If I was wrong about that, I apologize for the misunderstanding." What Holbrook Fenn had built over 30 years in Dusty Creek was less a ranching empire than a system. He owned land, yes, more than anyone else in the county, but what he really owned was the way things worked. He owned the assumptions. He owned the sense that certain things were simply how they were, and that questioning them was not just futile, but somehow impolite. He had acquired the Dunbar parcel in '79 by convincing old Lester Dunbar that the land wasn't worth as much as Lester thought. He had acquired the creek-adjacent section from the Parrish family in '82 by calling in a loan at an inconvenient time. He had built his diversion channel in the spring of '84 quietly, starting at the upper end where no one could see from the road, and finishing before anyone thought to ask questions. He had been counting on the Grady girl not knowing what she had. He had been counting on the Grady girl being the kind of person who got tired, got quiet, went away. He had been wrong about that. And now he was sitting at his own dinner table with 3 legal documents he had never seen before and a room full of witnesses he had invited himself. The merchant to Mabel's left, a man named Copeland, who ran the dry goods store and had been nodding along to everything Fenn said for approximately 15 years, shifted in his chair. "The survey map," Copeland said, almost to himself. "That's the 1869 one? I didn't think those had been filed at the county office." "They were filed in Cheyenne," Mabel said. "The county copies were lost in the courthouse fire in 1881. Fenn's attorney argued the originals were unavailable. They were available. They were just in Cheyenne. She didn't say, and I went there. She didn't need to." Copeland looked at Fenn. Fenn didn't say anything. Across the table, a rancher named August Seal, who had land adjacent to the section in question and who had also been experiencing unusually dry summers, was doing the particular kind of arithmetic that happens when a man realizes a problem he'd attributed to weather might actually have a different cause. "How much water?" Seal asked. "How much did he divert?" 40% of the flow in average years, Mabel said. Higher in drought years, when the diversion seemed proportionally more significant. Seal set down his spoon. "My east pasture," he said. 4 summers running. The timeline would be consistent, Mabel said, with the construction in spring of '84. Fenn pushed back from the table. "This is a private dinner, not a legal proceeding." "No," Weston said, "it's not. But the land office proceeding is scheduled for the 14th. And whatever happens here tonight, those documents are already in the record." The dinner ended without dessert. Dorothy Fenn excused herself at some point with a grace that Mabel found she genuinely admired. There was something to be said for a woman who could navigate the wreckage of an evening and still fold her napkin neatly. The guests departed with the careful haste of people who have suddenly found themselves witnesses to something they hadn't expected and need time to decide what they think about it. Copeland paused at the door and said to Mabel, quietly, "I've been overcharged on my water usage for 3 years. I always assumed it was the rates," she said. "Check the original survey on your eastern boundary." He nodded and left. August Seal shook Weston's hand and then, after a brief hesitation, shook Mabel's as well. Fenn did not see them to the door. His foreman, Crisp, did it instead, with the expression of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by anything his employer did, but was beginning to wonder about his own long-term employment prospects. In the buggy on the way back to Mabel's property, Weston was quiet for a long time. The road ran alongside the creek, which was running low for June, lower than it should have been. "You knew he'd try to discredit you," Weston finally said. "He always tries to discredit people who don't have anything behind them," Mabel said. "It usually works. He invites them somewhere public, says something that makes them feel small, and then whatever they say after that sounds like a complaint instead of a fact. You had the documents. I had the documents before he sent the invitation. I brought them because I thought there was a chance, a small chance, that he'd see them and agree to settle. It would have saved everyone trouble. He's not going to settle." "No," she said. "He's not." Then the 14th. Then the 14th. The buggy crossed the low bridge where the creek narrowed, and Mabel looked at the water. In her father's time, you could hear the creek from the front porch in spring. The sound of it had been one of the things she remembered about her childhood, a constant, generous sound, the sound of something that didn't run out. She hadn't heard it from the porch in 4 years. "I need one more thing," she said. Weston waited. The men who dug the channel. Briggs was the foreman, but he wasn't on a shovel. "I need at least 2 of the laborers who were. By name, by statement corroborating the date and the location." "I know where some of them went," Weston said. "After Fenn let them go, he let them go?" 3 months after the channel was finished. He paused. "I always thought that was strange. Good workers, all of them. He just released them." Mabel looked at the creek. "He didn't want them around to be asked questions," she said. "No," Weston said. "He didn't." The county land office proceeding on the 14th was not a trial. It was an administrative hearing, which meant it was conducted in a small room with bad light, and a hearing officer named Purcell, who had the expression of a man who had spent 20 years listening to disputes about fence lines and water rights, and had developed a face that gave nothing away. Fenn brought 2 lawyers. They were both from Cheyenne. They wore suits that cost more than Mabel's monthly expenses, and they carried leather cases with brass fittings. And one of them looked at Mabel when she came in, and then looked away again in the particular way that meant he'd decided she wasn't a factor. She had found 4 of Fenn's former laborers. 2 were working on the Seal Ranch. One was in Casper. One had gone back to his family in Nebraska, and she had reached him by letter, and he had written back with a statement signed and witnessed by a local magistrate. She had their affidavits. She had the survey maps. She had the engineering report. She had Tully Briggs' statement. She had a letter from the Cheyenne lawyer, who had been corresponding with her for 2 years, who had agreed to appear by written submission on her behalf. She also had August Seal, who had brought his own survey documents, and who had spent 2 weeks since Fenn's dinner doing the kind of arithmetic that ends friendships. And she had Weston Greer, who sat beside her and did not say much, because he had learned that the time for talking was the time for talking, and the time for letting evidence speak was the time for staying quiet. Fenn's lead lawyer made his opening argument for 40 minutes. It was technically proficient and built on the assumption that the original survey documents were either inaccessible or inadmissible. He used the phrase long-standing practice 7 times. He used the phrase good faith construction 4 times. He referred to Mabel once as the complainant and twice as the young woman in question, both times with a slight pause before the phrase that was not quite contempt but was close enough to be its cousin. When it was Mabel's turn, she stood up and put the 1869 survey map on Purcell's desk. "The creek boundary," she said, "is marked in red on page 3. The channel constructed by Fenn's crew in April of 1884 is marked in blue on the overlay I've prepared. The overlap is 62 feet. The easement is unambiguous. The diversion is illegal." She set down the engineering report. "This document was commissioned by the county assessor's office, not by me. It is independent verification of the deviation." She set down the 4 laborer affidavits. "These men dug the channel. They know where they dug it and when." She set down Briggs' statement. "This is the foreman's account." She set down the Nebraska letter. "This man wasn't available, but his magistrate witnessed statement is." She set down the Cheyenne letter. "This attorney has reviewed the complete file and submitted his analysis for the record." She paused. "I understand," she said, "that Miss Grady's complaint has been characterized as the grievance of a small landholder without resources. I'd like to suggest that the documents tell a different story. This isn't about my resources. It's about the law as it was written in 1869, and as it has remained written since. What changed is not the law. What changed is the creek." Purcell looked at the stack of documents on his desk. He looked at Fenn's lawyers. He looked at Mabel. He said, "I'll need 30 days to review the full record." Fenn's lead lawyer said, "We'd request that the submission be." 30 days, Purcell said again, and the tone of it closed that door. She was on her porch when Weston came by 3 weeks later. The day had been warm, the kind of warm that comes in late summer when the air still smells like grass instead of dust. And Mabel had been sitting with a cup of coffee she'd let go cold, watching the light change on the eastern pasture. The grass there was coming back, not fully. But the color of it was different than it had been in July, greener at the roots, the way grass looks when water is returning to the ground. "Purcell ruled," Weston said, and she heard it in his voice before he said the rest. "Full restoration of the water rights. Fenn is required to remove the diversion channel within 60 days, or the county will do it at his expense. He's also been assessed back damages for the years of illegal diversion, calculated per the engineering report." Mabel set down her coffee cup. She didn't say anything for a moment. The sound she heard from the creek was quiet still. It would take time for the water table to recover, but it was there, underneath the wind. "Copeland filed to," Weston said, "and seal. There are apparently 2 other landholders who've retained attorneys in the last 2 weeks. Good," she said. He sat down on the step below her. He took off his hat and turned it in his hands the way he did when he was thinking about something. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. How long have you been doing this? Not just this case. All of it. The letters to Cheyenne, the courthouse visits, the documents." She looked at the pasture. "Since I was 19, she said. "My father was about to sign something he didn't understand, and I didn't understand it either. But I knew there was something wrong with it, and I spent 3 days in the county records office before I figured out what. I stopped him from signing. What was it? A deed restriction Fenn's attorney had inserted into a purchase agreement for some equipment. It would have given Fenn first right of refusal on my father's land if he ever chose to sell." She paused. "He would have signed it. He trusted people. He didn't read the fine print because no one had ever told him to." Weston was quiet. "I read the fine print after that," she said. "For everything." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Mabel, I'm going to say something, and I need you to hear it as what it is, which is a simple and honest thing, not a complicated one." She waited. "I'd like to court you," he said, "if you're willing." The light was low now, the way it gets just before evening settles in, and the grasshoppers had started their noise, and somewhere down by the creek a meadowlark was working through its song. "I'm willing," she said. He put his hat back on. He looked at her with the directness that had always been the thing about him, the thing that made people trust him without quite being able to explain why, and he smiled, It wasn't a complicated smile. It was the kind that meant what it meant. "Good," he said. Holbrook Fenn removed the diversion channel within the 60 days, not because he accepted the ruling, but because his attorneys advised him that refusing would be more expensive than complying. He paid the back damages without public acknowledgement and stopped attending the monthly Ranchers Association meetings, which he had formerly chaired with the enthusiasm of a man who enjoyed being the person who decided when the meeting was over. Copeland won his case 6 months later. Seal won his the following spring. 2 other landholders settled before their hearings were scheduled, Fenn's attorneys apparently having concluded that the record Mabel had helped assemble was not favorable to continued litigation. Dorothy Fenn, by most accounts, remained gracious throughout all of it. She was seen at the church social in October, at the harvest dinner in November, and at the Christmas gathering in December, always folding her napkin neatly and speaking to everyone with the careful kindness of a woman who had learned long ago to maintain her own dignity regardless of what the man she was married to had done. Mabel did not see Fenn again until the spring county fair, where they passed each other near the livestock pens, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not quite hostility, not quite respect, something in between that didn't have a comfortable name. She nodded at him. He did not nod back, but he also moved out of her way, which was more than he had ever done before. She kept her land. She kept her 31 acres with the slightly leaning house, and the northeast pasture that was, by May, the greenest it had been in a decade. She kept her correspondence with the Cheyenne lawyer, who had sent her a letter after the ruling that said, simply, "You prepared a better case than most attorneys I have worked with. I mean that without qualification." She kept that letter in the same box as her father's papers. She also, the following June, married Weston Greer in a small ceremony at the Dusty Creek Church, attended by her neighbors, August Seal and his wife, old Copeland, who cried a little and pretended he hadn't, and a handful of others who had come to understand, over the course of a complicated year, that Mabel Grady was not a stray and had never been one. She was, as Weston had said at Fenn's dinner table, in a room full of people who had briefly confused money for value, worth more than anything Holbrook Fenn owned. She had always known that. It had just taken a little while for the rest of Dusty Creek to catch up. The creek ran full that summer, all the way through August, right up to the edge of the pasture where her father had always said the grass grew sweetest, and on the first morning she woke up in the house on Weston's ranch. Her house now, too, a house that did not lean. She heard it from the window, the sound of water, constant and generous, the sound of something that doesn't run out.